The concert hall fell into absolute silence. Not the polite, respectful silence of a classical music audience, but the stunned, breathless silence of people witnessing something they couldn't quite believe. Every eye was fixed on the grand piano at the center of the stage and on the small figure seated before it. His clothes were worn and dirty. His shoes had holes in them. His hands, though clean, now still bore the marks of sleeping rough on city streets. He was just a boy, no more than 12 years old, and he was homeless. But right now, none of that mattered, because right now, his fingers were dancing across the keys of a Steinway grand piano, bringing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 to life, with a passion and precision that left even the professional musicians in the audience shaking their heads in disbelief. In the front row, Thomas Whitmore, one of the most celebrated pianists in America, stood frozen. His program had fallen from his hands. His mouth was slightly open, and in his eyes there was something beyond shock, beyond amazement. There was recognition, there was memory, there was something that looked almost like grief. "It can't be," he whispered to himself. "That touch, that phrasing, it's impossible." But how did this moment come to be? How did a homeless boy end up performing at a charity concert attended by the city's elite? And why did his playing make a famous pianist look as though he'd seen a ghost? To understand this moment, we need to go back. Back to 3 hours earlier, when everything was still normal, when nobody knew what was about to unfold. The Henderson Community Center stood proud in the heart of downtown, its elegant facade lit up against the evening sky. Tonight was special. Tonight was the annual Harmony for Hope charity concert, an event that drew the city's wealthiest philanthropists, its most influential cultural figures, and its most discerning music lovers. Black limousines lined the circular driveway. Women in evening gowns and men in tailored suits made their way up the marble steps, their jewelry catching the light, their conversations filled with anticipation. The air hummed with the kind of refined excitement that comes when culture and charity intersect, when people can feel good about themselves while enjoying something beautiful. Inside the main hall, the atmosphere was even more impressive. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over rows of plush velvet seats. The stage was set with a magnificent Steinway Model D concert grand piano, its black lacquer surface gleaming under the stage lights. Flower arrangements in subtle, sophisticated colors adorned the space. Everything spoke of taste, of money, of a certain kind of life. Programs rustled as people found their seats. The program cover announced the evening's featured performer, Thomas Whitmore, renowned concert pianist graduate of Juilliard, winner of the prestigious Tchaikovsky competition, a musician whose recordings had topped classical charts, and whose performances commanded sold-out audiences in concert halls from New York to Vienna. "I heard he's phenomenal," one woman whispered to her companion. "Simply transcendent. They say he has perfect pitch," another replied. "And his interpretation of the romantic composers is unmatched." The excitement was palpable. This was why they'd come, why they'd paid $200 per ticket. To witness greatness. To say they'd been there. To be part of something elevated, something apart from the ordinary world outside these walls. But they had no idea that the most extraordinary performance of the night wouldn't come from the man whose name was printed on their programs. While the hall filled with the cream of society, a very different figure approached the building from the side street. Elijah moved slowly, keeping to the shadows, his eyes taking in the scene with a mixture of longing and resignation. He was 12 years old, though the hardships of the past 2 years had given him the cautious, watchful manner of someone much older. His jeans were too short, exposing thin ankles above sneakers that were more hole than shoe. His jacket, several sizes too large, had probably been donated to a shelter and discarded. His backpack, his only possession in the world, contained everything he owned: a change of clothes, a bottle of water, and something wrapped carefully in an old t-shirt. Elijah hadn't planned to come here tonight. He'd been sleeping in the doorway of a closed bookstore 3 blocks away when he heard the music drifting through the evening air. It was a sound check, a pianist warming up. Just a few scales, a fragment of melody. But it had pulled at something deep inside him, something that had been sleeping for 6 months now, since the day his grandfather passed away in the corner of a homeless shelter, his hand growing cold in Elijah's grip. The boy knew he shouldn't go in. He knew how he looked, how he smelled, despite his attempts to wash in public restrooms. He knew the kind of looks he would get, the kind of people who would be inside. But the pull of the music was too strong. It had always been too strong. He circled around to the back entrance, the one where delivery people came and went. A caterer's van was being unloaded. In the chaos of activity, nobody noticed a thin boy slipping through the door, moving like a shadow down the hallway toward the sound of voices and music. The main hall was already mostly full when Elijah peered through the entrance. For a moment, he almost turned back. The contrast was too stark, too painful. These people lived in a world so different from his that they might as well be from another planet. Their clothes cost more than he'd ever had in his life. Their casual conversations spoke of vacation homes and private schools and investment portfolios. But then the lights began to dim, and in the darkness, Elijah slipped into the hall. He found a seat in the very back row in the corner, as far from everyone else as he could manage. A few people near him shifted uncomfortably, catching a whiff of the street on his clothes. But in the gathering darkness, most didn't notice him at all. Elijah sank into his seat, making himself as small as possible. His heart was pounding, partly from fear of being discovered and thrown out, but mostly from anticipation, because he was about to hear something he hadn't heard in so long. Real music. Live music. Music played by someone who understood it the way his grandfather had understood it. The applause began even before Thomas Whitmore appeared. It grew as he walked onto the stage, a tall man in his early 40s, elegant in his formal concert attire, his posture perfect, his expression serene with the confidence of someone completely at home in his element. He acknowledged the applause with a slight bow, then settled himself at the piano. The audience fell silent immediately, the kind of attentive silence that shows respect for mastery about to be displayed. Thomas placed his hands on the keys, paused for a moment, then began to play. It was Chopin, the Ballade No. 1 in G minor. From the first notes, it was clear why Thomas Whitmore commanded such fees, such acclaim. His technique was flawless. Yes, but it was more than that. There was poetry in his playing, a deep understanding of the emotional landscape of the music. The notes didn't just follow each other. They spoke to each other, created conversations, told stories. The audience was transfixed. This was what they had come for. This was art at its highest level. But in the back corner, Elijah was experiencing something different from everyone else in the room. As he listened, his eyes closed, his breathing slowed, and he was transported. Not just to the world of Chopin's music, but to another time, another place. To a cramped room in a community center on the poor side of town, where an old man with weathered hands sat at an ancient upright piano, its keys yellowed with age, some of them sticking the pedals creaking. "Listen to this part, Elijah." His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. Right here, Chopin is asking a question, and here just a few measures later he's answering it. Music is conversation. It's not just notes on a page, it's people talking to each other across time. Elijah's lips moved silently following the music. His fingers twitched slightly in his lap, unconsciously mimicking the fingerings, the touch, the phrasing. He'd heard his grandfather play this piece 100 times. He'd practiced it himself on the paper keyboard they'd made, the one that his grandfather had drawn by hand on a piece of cardboard, because they couldn't afford even a cheap electronic keyboard anymore. When Thomas finished the ballade, the applause was thunderous. People were on their feet. A woman in the third row dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. This was the kind of performance that reminded people why music mattered, why beauty mattered. Thomas played 2 more pieces, each one a masterclass in interpretation and technique. The audience was enraptured. They'd gotten more than their money's worth already, and the evening was only half over. Finally, Thomas stood and bowed deeply. "Thank you," he said, his voice warm and cultivated. "We'll take a brief intermission, and then I'll return for the second half of the program." As the house lights came up and people began to rise, stretching, heading for refreshments, Elijah remained in his seat. His eyes were fixed on the piano, gleaming under the stage lights. In his mind, he could hear his grandfather's voice, not a memory this time, but something stronger, something that felt almost like a command. Music is a gift, Elijah, and gifts are meant to be shared. The intermission buzzed with animated conversation. In the lobby, champagne flowed and canapes circulated. People discussed Thomas Whitmore's technique, his interpretation comparing this performance to others they'd heard. "Simply marvelous," one man declared. "His rubato in the Chopin was perfection itself." "I've heard him 3 times now," a woman added. "He just gets better and better." Thomas himself stood near the refreshment table, graciously accepting compliments, answering questions, playing the role of the distinguished artist with practiced ease. This was part of the job, and he did it well. But part of his mind was already on the second half of the program, the Rachmaninoff that was his signature piece. Inside the hall, most people had left their seats, but a few remained. And in the back corner, Elijah sat motionless, his eyes still on the piano. Something was building inside him, a feeling he hadn't experienced since his grandfather died. It was a kind of pressure, a need, almost a hunger. Slowly, he stood up. His heart was hammering now, his palms sweating. What he was thinking of doing was crazy. They would throw him out. They would laugh at him. They would call security and have him arrested for trespassing. But his feet were moving anyway, carrying him down the aisle toward the stage. Each step felt both terrifying and inevitable. He could turn back. He should turn back. But he didn't. The stage was empty. The piano waited. Elijah climbed the steps on the side, his worn sneakers silent on the polished wood. Up close, the Steinway was even more magnificent than it had seemed from a distance. Its surface was so polished he could see his reflection, a thin boy with scared eyes and messy hair. He was reaching toward the keys when a voice stopped him. "Hey, what are you doing up there?" Elijah spun around. A security guard was striding down the aisle, his face stern. Several people in the lobby, hearing the commotion, turned to look. More came to see what was happening. I said, "What are you doing?" The guard repeated, his hand already reaching for his radio. "You can't be up there. In fact, I don't think you're even supposed to be in this building." "How did you get in here?" Elijah's voice, when it came, was soft but clear. "I just wanted to. I thought maybe." "He's homeless," someone in the audience whispered loudly enough for others to hear. "Look at him. He probably snuck in to steal something. Call the police, another voice suggested. Thomas Whitmore, hearing the disturbance, came back into the hall. He took in the scene with a quick glance, the boy on his stage, the guard approaching the gathering crowd, watching with expressions ranging from concern to disgust to amusement. "What's going on?" Thomas asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being listened to. The security guard turned to him. "I'm sorry, Mr. Whitmore. This kid snuck in somehow. I'm removing him now. I apologize for the disruption." Thomas looked at Elijah more closely. The boy's eyes were wide, frightened, but there was something else in them too. Something that gave Thomas pause. Elijah, seeing the famous pianist looking at him, found his voice again. "Excuse me, sir," he said, the words coming out in a rush before he could lose his courage. "I know I shouldn't be here. I know I don't belong. But I heard you playing, and it was so beautiful, and could I play? Just one piece, just for a moment." The request hung in the air. Several people in the audience laughed. Not unkindly, but with the kind of amusement reserved for the absurd. "The boy wants to play." Someone chuckled. "That's precious. Someone should teach these street kids to stay in their place," another voice muttered. The security guard grabbed Elijah's arm. "Come on, kid, let's go." But Thomas held up a hand. "Wait," he said. Everyone looked at him in surprise. The guard loosened his grip slightly but didn't let go. Thomas studied the boy for a long moment. There was something about him, something in those eyes. They weren't the eyes of someone looking for attention or trying to cause trouble. They were the eyes of someone who needed music the way other people needed air. Thomas had seen eyes like that before. A long time ago, in a mirror. "Let him play," Thomas said quietly. "Mr. Whitmore." The guard protested. "I really don't think—" "Let him play," Thomas repeated, his voice firmer now. "One piece. What harm could it do?" The guard reluctantly released Elijah's arm. The audience, sensing drama, began filing back into their seats. This was unexpected, potentially entertaining. They settled in with the anticipation of spectators about to witness something unusual, possibly embarrassing. Elijah stood frozen for a moment, unable to believe what was happening. The famous pianist had said yes. He was being given permission. But now that he had it, the enormity of what he was about to attempt crashed over him like a wave. These people were expecting him to fail. They were expecting him to make a fool of himself. And maybe he would. He'd never played on a real concert grand before. He'd never played for an audience of more than one. All his practice had been in secret, in small moments, stolen from the cruelty of street life. But his grandfather's voice was in his head again, stronger now, clearer than it had been since the day he died. "Music doesn't care where you sleep at night, Elijah. It doesn't care about your clothes or your address. When you sit down at those keys, the only thing that matters is what's in your heart and what you've put in your fingers. Now play. Play for me. Play for yourself. Play for everyone who told you that you couldn't." Elijah walked to the piano bench and sat down. The bench was the right height, adjusted for Thomas Whitmore's frame. Elijah's feet barely touched the pedals. His hands looked small, almost childlike, hovering over the keys. There were a few stifled giggles from the audience. Thomas stood off to the side, his arms crossed, his expression neutral. He'd given the boy permission, but he was already second-guessing himself. This was a mistake. The kid would play chopsticks or maybe the first few measures of something he'd heard on the radio, and it would be awkward and uncomfortable, and Thomas would have to find a gracious way to end it and get on with the real concert. Elijah closed his eyes. He took a deep breath, and then his hands descended to the keys. The first notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat, major op. 9, number 2 floated into the air. For a moment, nothing changed. The audience still wore their expressions of amused tolerance. The security guard still looked annoyed. This was going about how everyone expected. But then something shifted. The notes weren't just correct. They were beautiful. The touch was perfect, delicate where it needed to be, firm where the music demanded it. The phrasing was exquisite, each phrase shaped like a breath, like natural speech. The giggles stopped. The shuffling stopped. People sat up straighter in their seats. Thomas Whitmore's arms uncrossed. He took a step closer to the piano, his head tilted, listening with the intensity of someone who understands what they're hearing. Because what he was hearing was impossible. Technical proficiency could be learned with enough time and practice, even with limited resources. But this wasn't just technical proficiency. This was musicianship. This was interpretation. This was someone who understood the emotional architecture of the piece, who knew not just what notes to play, but why those notes mattered. Elijah's thin fingers moved across the keys with a grace that seemed at odds with everything else about him. His eyes were closed, his face serene, and in this moment it didn't matter that his clothes were dirty or that he had no home. In this moment, he was exactly where he belonged. The Nocturne is not a long piece, but it has many opportunities for expression, for showing whether a pianist truly understands the music or is just playing notes. The middle section in particular requires a subtle shift in tone, a move from the dreamy opening to something more passionate, more urgent, before returning to the opening theme transformed by what has come between. Elijah navigated these shifts perfectly. His rubato, the slight speeding up and slowing down that gives romantic music its breathing quality, was natural and felt rather than calculated. His dynamics from the softest pianissimo to the richest forte were controlled and intentional. In the audience, the woman who had been dabbing her eyes earlier found herself reaching for her handkerchief again. But now it wasn't because of Thomas Whitmore's playing. It was because a homeless boy was pulling emotions from a piano that she didn't know she possessed. A man in the 5th row. A music professor at the local university leaned forward with his hands gripping the seat in front of him. He taught piano. He'd heard hundreds of students play this exact piece, but he'd rarely heard it played like this. There was something in the boy's interpretation, something he couldn't quite name, that spoke of genuine understanding of music that had been lived rather than merely learned. Thomas stood motionless now, his professional composure cracking slightly. His mind was racing. How was this possible? Where had this boy learned to play like this? Who had taught him? And then, as Elijah played the return of the opening theme, Thomas heard something that made his breath catch in his throat. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone who hadn't spent years studying piano, years learning the nuances of different teachers and different schools of playing. But it was there. The particular way Elijah shaped the phrase at the end of each melodic line. The specific voicing he used to bring out the inner melody beneath the main theme. The touch on the keys, firm but never harsh, singing but never sentimental. Thomas had heard this before. He'd learned to play this very piece with exactly these interpretive choices. 20 years ago, from a teacher whose name he hadn't spoken in longer than he cared to admit. Samuel Morrison. No, Thomas thought. It can't be. Samuel never mentioned having a grandson. And even if he did, how would the boy have learned from him? Samuel had been retired for years. And the last Thomas had heard, which was admittedly a very long time ago, Samuel had been sick, struggling, but the evidence was in every note. This wasn't just good playing. This was playing in a specific tradition with specific choices that could only have come from one source. Elijah played the final notes of the nocturne, letting them fade into silence the way they were meant to, not cut off, but allowed to die naturally, like a sigh at the end of a long day. For a moment after he finished, there was absolute silence. Then the applause began. Not polite, appreciative applause. Not the kind of applause you give to be nice. This was genuine, stunned, overwhelming applause. People were on their feet. Some were cheering. The music professor was shaking his head in disbelief. The woman with the handkerchief was openly crying now. Elijah opened his eyes, looking startled, as if he'd forgotten where he was. The sound of applause seemed to shock him back to reality. He stood up quickly, stepping away from the piano, his face flushing with embarrassment, or perhaps fear that he'd done something wrong. But Thomas Whitmore was walking toward him now, and the expression on the famous pianist's face was not anger or annoyance. It was something much more complicated. "Who taught you to play like that?" Thomas asked, his voice barely audible over the continuing applause. Elijah looked at him with wide eyes. "My grandfather, sir." "Your grandfather," Thomas repeated. "What was his name?" Samuel Elijah said softly. "Samuel Morrison." The color drained from Thomas Whitmore's face. Thomas gestured for the audience to quiet down, which they did, though reluctantly. Everyone could sense that something was happening here, something beyond just an unexpected performance by an unlikely pianist. "Please," Thomas said to Elijah, his voice gentle. "Now sit with me for a moment." He led the boy to a pair of chairs at the side of the stage, usually reserved for performers between pieces. The audience watched, fascinated. The security guard, no longer sure what his role was in this situation, stood awkwardly near the door. "Tell me about your grandfather," Thomas said quietly, though his voice carried in the hushed hall. He wasn't performing anymore. He was asking a question that genuinely mattered to him. Elijah hesitated. He wasn't used to people wanting to hear his story. Most people saw him on the street and looked away embarrassed or uncomfortable, or simply indifferent. His story wasn't one that polite society wanted to hear. But there was something in Thomas Whitmore's expression, a kind of intensity and sadness combined, that made Elijah feel like maybe this time someone actually cared about the answer. "My grandfather was a piano teacher." Elijah began, his voice soft but steady. He taught at the community center on the east side of town. Not the nice part of town, the part where people don't usually go unless they live there. A few people in the audience shifted uncomfortably. They knew the area he meant. It was the part of the city that they drove through quickly. Windows up, doors locked. He didn't charge much. Elijah continued. Sometimes he didn't charge anything at all if he knew a family couldn't pay. He said music was too important to be kept away from people just because they were poor. Thomas nodded slowly, his eyes glistening. "That sounds like Samuel," he murmured. "My parents." Elijah went on, his voice getting quieter. They both worked. My mom was a nurse at the county hospital, and my dad drove a delivery truck. We didn't have a lot, but we had enough. We had an apartment. We had food. I went to school, and I had my grandfather. He paused, swallowing hard. This was the difficult part, the part where the story changed from normal life to the nightmare he was living now. 2 years ago, there was an accident. A truck ran a red light. My parents were coming home from my mom's shift at the hospital. They died instantly. That's what the police said. They said it was instant, that they didn't feel any pain. The audience was completely silent now. This wasn't the kind of story they'd expected to hear at a charity concert. This was real. This was raw. After they died, Elijah continued. Things got complicated. I didn't have any other family except my grandfather, and he was already retired, living on Social Security. It wasn't enough to support both of us, not in any real way. We tried. We really tried. But the money ran out, and we lost the apartment, and then we were on the street. He looked down at his hands, the same hands that had just played Chopin with such beauty. People think being homeless is simple, like it's just not having a house. But it's more than that. It's not having anywhere to be. It's people looking through you like you don't exist. It's being tired all the time but never feeling safe enough to really sleep. It's being hungry but not knowing when you'll eat again. It's being cold or hot and having no way to change it. Thomas listened without interrupting his jaw, tight, his eyes fixed on the boy. But my grandfather Elijah said, and now his voice brightened just slightly, he never stopped teaching me. Even when we were sleeping in shelters or under bridges, even when we were eating at soup kitchens, he found ways to keep teaching me music. How someone in the audience asked, unable to contain their curiosity. Elijah looked up. He made me a keyboard out of cardboard. He drew all the keys, labeled them all, and he would tap out rhythms on the ground, on walls, on anything, teaching me to hear the music even when we couldn't make the sounds. He'd hum pieces to me, make me hum them back. When we could, we'd sneak into churches or community centers that had pianos, and he'd let me practice for a few minutes before someone made us leave. He paused, remembering. Sometimes we'd stand outside music stores where they had pianos in the windows. We couldn't go in, but we could watch and listen when other people played. Grandpa would explain what they were doing, why they made the choices they made, what he would do differently. He sounds like a remarkable man, Thomas said, his voice thick. He was. Elijah agreed. Then his voice dropped. He died 6 months ago. Pneumonia. We were staying in a shelter, and he got sick, and we couldn't afford medicine, and by the time we got him to the emergency room, it was too late. He died in the hospital. I was holding his hand. Several people in the audience were crying openly now. This wasn't what they'd come for. They'd come to feel good about themselves, to enjoy beautiful music in beautiful surroundings, to write a check for charity, and feel like they'd made a difference. But now they were confronted with the reality of what charity was supposed to address, the actual human cost of poverty and loss and systems that failed the most vulnerable. His last words to me. Elijah said, his own voice breaking now, were about music. He said, "Elijah, you have a gift. Don't let the world tell you it doesn't matter just because you're poor. Don't let anyone take music away from you. It's the one thing that's yours, that belongs to you no matter where you sleep or what you wear. When you play, you're free. When you play, you're home." Thomas stood abruptly, turning away for a moment, his hand over his face. When he turned back, there were tears on his cheeks, and he made no attempt to hide them. "I knew your grandfather," he said, his voice carrying across the hall. 20 years ago, Samuel Morrison taught me to play piano." A murmur of surprise ran through the audience. Elijah's eyes went wide. Thomas continued speaking to both Elijah and the audience now. "I was 9 years old. My mother was a single parent working 2 jobs. We lived in a tiny apartment on the east side. We had nothing. No money for lessons, no money for a piano, no money for anything beyond basic survival." He walked back to the piano, running his hand along its polished surface. But my mother had heard that there was a teacher at the community center who taught kids for free. She took me there one Saturday, and that's where I met Samuel Morrison. Thomas turned to face the audience, his professional composure completely abandoned now. He taught me twice a week for 5 years. He never charged us a penny. He gave me everything. He taught me technique. Yes, but more than that, he taught me that music was a conversation, a way of speaking when words weren't enough. He taught me discipline and patience. He taught me that art matters, that beauty matters even when the world around you is harsh and ugly. He looked directly at Elijah. He taught me the same way he taught you. I can hear it in your playing. The same touch, the same phrasing, the same understanding of what the music is trying to say. He gave you what he gave me, the foundation, the beginning. Then what happened? Elijah asked softly. Why didn't you? He didn't finish the sentence, but everyone knew what he was asking. Why didn't you stay in touch? Why didn't you help him? Why did he die poor and forgotten while you became rich and famous? Thomas's face crumpled. I don't have a good answer, he admitted. When I was 14, I won a scholarship to a prestigious music academy in New York. It was a full ride, everything paid for. It was the opportunity of a lifetime. Samuel encouraged me to go. He was so proud. He paused, the shame evident in his voice. I went. And at first I wrote to him. I told him about my teachers, my progress. But then time passed. I got busy. I was working so hard, practicing 6, 7, 8 hours a day. I was competing, performing, building a career. The world I was living in got further and further away from where I came from. And eventually the letters stopped. The calls stopped. I told myself I'd reach out when I had made it, when I could really make a difference. But years passed, and I never did. He looked at Elijah with an expression of profound regret. I owe everything I am to your grandfather. Every success, every accomplishment, every beautiful moment I've experienced through music, it all started with him. And I never thanked him properly. I never went back. I never helped him when he needed it. I was so focused on my own career, my own life, that I forgot about the man who made it all possible. The silence in the hall was profound. This was confession, public and painful. This was a successful man admitting to a fundamental failure of character. I tried to find him a few years ago, Thomas continued. I finally thought to look him up, to reach out. But the community center had closed. The phone numbers I had didn't work. I asked around, but nobody knew where he'd gone. And then I told myself he was probably fine, that he'd retired somewhere nice, that he didn't need me showing up after all these years. He turned back to Elijah. But he wasn't fine. He was on the street. And I could have helped. If I'd tried harder to find him, if I'd really cared, instead of just feeling guilty, and then moving on with my life, I could have helped. Elijah stood up from his chair. He never talked about you being ungrateful, he said quietly. When he mentioned you, which he did, sometimes he just said he was proud. He'd see your name on posters or in the paper and he'd show me. That's one of my students, he'd say. I taught him when he was just a little older than you. Look what he became. He was just proud. This somehow made it worse. Thomas covered his face with both hands, his shoulders shaking. In the audience, people didn't know where to look. This was too intimate, too real. They'd come for entertainment, and instead they were witnessing something that felt like it should be private, a moment of genuine human pain and regret. But they couldn't look away. After a long moment, Thomas lowered his hands and took a deep breath, composing himself with visible effort. He looked at Elijah with a new determination in his eyes. Will you play something else? He asked. Elijah hesitated. I don't know if I should. I've already taken up so much time. Your concert? The concert can wait, Thomas interrupted firmly. Please, play something else. Play whatever your grandfather taught you. Elijah looked uncertain, glancing at the audience at the piano, at Thomas. Finally, he nodded. He returned to the piano bench, and this time he adjusted it himself, making it a bit lower to accommodate his shorter frame. The audience settled back in their seats. no longer amused or skeptical, but genuinely eager to hear what would come next. Elijah placed his hands on the keys and began to play Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, first movement. From the opening notes, it was clear that the Chopin hadn't been a fluke. This was a young man who had been seriously trained, who had spent countless hours developing not just technical facility, but musical understanding. The Moonlight Sonata is one of the most famous piano pieces in the world, but it's also one of the most difficult to play well. Its simplicity is deceptive. There's nowhere to hide, no flashy runs to distract from a lack of depth. It requires absolute control, perfect voicing, and an understanding of how to sustain tension over a long, slow arc. Elijah played it perfectly. The repeated triplets in the right hand were even and controlled, never rushing, never dragging. The bass notes in the left hand sang out with exactly the right emphasis, creating a foundation that felt both solid and sorrowful. The middle voice, often neglected by less skilled pianists, was carefully balanced, creating the rich, harmonic texture that gives the piece its distinctive melancholy character. As Thomas listened, he began to hear more than just the music. He began to hear specific choices, specific phrasings that took him back 2 decades. He could almost hear Samuel's voice in his head. "This piece is about restraint, Thomas. It's not about what you play, it's about what you hold back. Every note wants to be louder, wants to rush forward, but you have to keep it reined in, keep it controlled. That's where the emotion comes from the tension between what the music wants to do and what you make it do." Elijah was applying exactly that principle. The piece never erupted, never broke free of its careful boundaries, but the emotional impact was enormous, precisely because of that restraint. Thomas found himself moving closer to the piano, watching Elijah's hands, his posture, the subtle movements of his body as he played. And the more he watched, the more convinced he became. This wasn't just someone who had studied with Samuel. This was someone who had been shaped by him, molded by his approach to music and to teaching. There were specific technical things too, things that only someone who had studied with Samuel would know. The way Elijah held his wrists slightly higher than most modern teachers advocate. The way he used his whole arm for the forte passages rather than just his fingers. The particular way he approached the pedal, changing it not on the beat, but just slightly after creating a richer wash of sound. These were Samuel's trademarks. Thomas had been taught to do exactly the same things, and he still did them all these years later. They were part of his own playing now, so ingrained that he didn't even think about them anymore. Watching Elijah was like looking into a mirror that showed the past. Thomas saw himself at 9, 10, 11 years old, sitting in that community center with the old upright piano, Samuel beside him, on a folding chair, patiently demonstrating, explaining, encouraging. Samuel had been in his 60s, even then, his hair already gray, his hands showing the first signs of arthritis. But when he played, when he taught, he was ageless. He had a passion for music that was contagious, a belief in its power to transform lives that was absolute. "Music saved my life," Samuel had told young Thomas once. "I grew up poor like you. Poorer, maybe. But I found music, and it gave me something that poverty couldn't touch. It gave me beauty. It gave me meaning. It gave me a way to express things I didn't have words for. And now I want to give that to others. That's why I teach. That's why I'll always teach as long as I have breath in my body." And he had taught. Right up until the end, from what Elijah had said. Teaching with a cardboard keyboard, humming melodies in homeless shelters, finding moments at public pianos. Never giving up, never letting the cruelty of circumstances extinguish his belief in the power of music to matter. Thomas felt a wave of emotion so strong it almost knocked him backward. Shame, yes, for having abandoned the man who had given him everything, but also gratitude profound and overwhelming for the gift he'd been given. And something else, too. Something that felt almost like purpose, like a door opening onto a path he was supposed to take. Elijah finished the Moonlight Sonata with the same control he'd maintained throughout, letting the final notes fade into silence, like the last light of day disappearing below the horizon. The applause this time was even more intense than before. People were standing again, clapping until their hands hurt. Some were still crying. The music professor was shaking his head in wonder, already mentally composing the email he would send to colleagues about what he'd witnessed tonight. But Thomas barely heard the applause. He was staring at Elijah with an intensity that made the boy uncomfortable. When the applause finally died down, Thomas spoke, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. "Your grandfather was one of the finest teachers I've ever known," he said, "and he clearly passed his gift on to you. You don't just play beautifully, you play with understanding, with depth, with soul. Those are things that can't be taught through technique alone. They have to be transmitted from someone who truly understands music to someone who is ready to receive it." He paused, then continued. "Samuel gave that to me. And before he died, he gave it to you. In a way, we're connected, you and I. We're both his students. We both carry his legacy." Elijah nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Thomas made a decision then, one that felt both impulsive and utterly right. "I want to hear you play one more piece," he said, "but not alone this time." He walked to the piano and sat down on the bench beside Elijah. The boy looked at him with wide, surprised eyes. "Do you know Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2? Thomas asked. Elijah nodded slowly. "My grandfather taught it to me. It was his favorite. He said it was the most beautiful piece ever written." Thomas smiled, and it was the first genuine smile he'd worn all evening. "Samuel used to say the exact same thing to me. It was his favorite, too." He looked out at the audience. For those of you who don't know, a piano concerto is typically written for a solo pianist with orchestral accompaniment. We don't have an orchestra here tonight, but we have 2 pianos worth of hands. We can do an arrangement. He turned back to Elijah. "I'll take the orchestral parts simplified. You take the solo. Together, we'll play the first movement. Can you do that?" Elijah looked terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. "I've never played with anyone before," he admitted. "Then it's time you started," Thomas said gently. "Samuel would want this. I think you know he would." Elijah nodded. He did know. This was exactly what his grandfather would have wanted. To see his 2 students separated by 20 years, but connected by his teaching, making music together. "Ready?" Thomas asked. "Ready," Elijah confirmed, his voice stronger now. Thomas began with the orchestral introduction, his hands moving lower on the keyboard to approximate the deep, rich sound of cellos and basses that open the concerto. Even simplified, even without the full orchestra, the music was powerful. Those opening chords, descending like fate itself, filled the hall with their dark beauty. And then Elijah came in with the piano solo, those famous opening measures that have been described as some of the most beautiful in all of classical music. His hands, small as they were, drew out the melody with a singing tone that made it clear he understood what he was playing. This wasn't just notes. This was a cry from the heart, a meditation on longing and beauty and sadness and hope all mixed together. Thomas listened for a moment, then adapted his accompaniment to match Elijah's tempo, his phrasing, his interpretation. This was how concertos worked the orchestra and soloist in conversation responding to each other, breathing together. But this was more than just a musical collaboration. This was two people connected across time by the same teacher, the same philosophy, the same love of music. Thomas heard echoes of his younger self in Elijah's playing, and Elijah, for his part, could hear the professional mastery that his grandfather had always told him was possible, the place where years of practice and dedication could lead. The audience watched, transfixed. Many of them knew the Rachmaninoff concerto. Some had heard it performed by major orchestras in major concert halls, but they'd never heard it like this, never seen it played by two people who were using the music to bridge a gap of loss and regret and time. As they played, Thomas found himself thinking about Samuel. Not with guilt this time, but with genuine fondness, with gratitude. He remembered specific lessons, specific moments. The time Samuel had stayed late to help him prepare for a competition. The time he'd found Thomas crying in frustration over a difficult passage and had sat with him not saying much, just being present until the boy felt ready to try again. The time Samuel had told him with absolute certainty, "You have what it takes." Not just the talent, but the heart. Don't let anyone tell you different. Those words had carried Thomas through some dark times in his career, through the competitions he didn't win, through the rejections and setbacks that are part of any artist's life. Samuel's belief in him had become his belief in himself. And now, playing beside Elijah Thomas, understood that Samuel's legacy hadn't died with him. It was here in this boy's hands, in his understanding of music, in his ability to find beauty even in the worst circumstances. The first movement of the Rachmaninoff Second Piano Concerto is not short. It builds and develops over roughly 12 minutes, taking the listener through multiple emotional landscapes. There are passages of tremendous power where both hands are required to produce the massive chords and runs. There are passages of delicate beauty where the piano sings with an almost vocal quality. There are moments of urgency and moments of repose. Elijah and Thomas navigated all of it together. There were moments when they weren't perfectly synchronized, when Elijah's inexperience showed, or when Thomas's adaptation of the orchestral part wasn't quite seamless. But these small imperfections didn't matter. What mattered was the spirit of what they were doing, the meaning behind it. As they approached the climax of the movement, Thomas found himself playing with an emotional intensity he rarely allowed himself in performance. Professional musicians are trained to maintain control, to never let emotion overpower technique. But tonight, all of that went out the window. He was playing for Samuel, his teacher, his mentor, the man who had believed in him when no one else did. He was playing with Samuel's other student, the boy Samuel had continued to teach, even when he had nothing, even when the world had abandoned him. And in a way, Thomas thought Samuel was here with them. Not literally, not physically, but present nonetheless, in every note, in every phrase, in the connection between the two pianists who were his legacy. Elijah, for his part, was playing the best he'd ever played in his life. The nervousness that had gripped him earlier was gone, burned away by the intensity of the music and the unique nature of this moment. He was playing on a real concert grand piano, in a real concert hall, with a world-famous pianist who had been taught by the same person who taught him. It was impossible, and yet it was happening. He thought about his grandfather, about those last words in the hospital. When you play, you're free. When you play, you're home. He was home now. For these minutes, at least, he had a home. It was made of sound and time and shared understanding, and it was the most real home he'd had in 2 years. The final passages of the movement build to a tremendous conclusion, the piano and orchestra, or in this case, Thomas's improvised orchestral part, coming together in a massive statement of the main theme, now transformed from its gentle opening into something triumphant and powerful. Elijah and Thomas played these final measures together, their hands moving in parallel, their breathing synchronized their shared understanding of the music, allowing them to end at exactly the same moment, on exactly the same note, with exactly the same intensity. The last chord rang out in the hall, fading slowly into silence. For a moment, no one moved. The audience sat frozen, not wanting to break the spell, not wanting to return to normal reality after what they'd just witnessed. Then someone stood. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, the entire audience was on its feet, applauding with a fervor that shook the walls. This wasn't polite appreciation. This was people responding to something that had moved them at a fundamental level, something they knew they would remember for the rest of their lives. Thomas stood and pulled Elijah up with him. They bowed together, teacher and student separated by age and experience, but united by music and by the man who had taught them both. When Thomas looked at Elijah, he saw that the boy was crying, tears streaming down his face. But he was also smiling a huge, genuine smile that transformed his entire appearance. Thomas put his arm around Elijah's shoulders and pulled him close. "Thank you," he said, his words barely audible over the continuing applause. "Thank you for this. Thank you for showing me what Samuel gave us both." Elijah couldn't speak. He just nodded, letting himself lean against this stranger, who somehow wasn't a stranger at all, who understood something fundamental about him that most people would never understand. The applause continued for what felt like forever. People were cheering now, calling out their approval. The music professor was on his feet, clapping harder than anyone. The woman who'd been crying earlier was sobbing openly, but with joy this time, rather than sadness. Even the security guard who had started the evening ready to throw Elijah out was clapping, a bemused expression on his face, as if he couldn't quite believe what he'd witnessed. Finally, Thomas held up his hands for silence. The crowd reluctantly quieted, sitting back down, though the energy in the room remained electric. Thomas kept his hand on Elijah's shoulder as he addressed the audience. His professional demeanor had returned somewhat, but there was a new warmth in it, a vulnerability that hadn't been there at the beginning of the evening. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I think you can all see that this has been an unusual night. This wasn't what I planned. This wasn't what any of us planned. But sometimes the most important moments in our lives are the ones we don't plan." He paused, looking at Elijah. "This young man, Elijah, is homeless. He has been living on the streets for 2 years since he lost his parents and then his grandfather. He has nothing, no home, no family, no resources. But he has a gift, a profound, extraordinary gift for music." Thomas turned back to the audience. "And he has that gift because of a man named Samuel Morrison, who taught him the same way he taught me 20 years ago." Samuel believed that music was too important to be kept away from people just because they were poor. He believed that beauty and art and meaning should be available to everyone, not just the privileged few. A few people in the audience shifted uncomfortably. The implicit criticism was clear. Samuel taught for free, or nearly free, his entire life. Thomas continued. He could have made more money teaching wealthy students. He could have built a comfortable retirement. But he chose to teach in poor neighborhoods to work with kids who had nothing because he believed they deserved access to beauty just as much as anyone else. Thomas's voice grew stronger. And you know what? He was right. You heard Elijah play tonight. You heard the depth, the skill, the understanding. This isn't someone who was born into privilege, who had every advantage. This is someone who learned music on a cardboard keyboard, who practiced on public pianos during stolen moments, who never gave up even when he had every reason to. He looked out at the audience with something almost like challenge in his eyes. We talk a lot about talent, about genius, about the importance of art and culture. But how often do we actually invest in it? How often do we look for talent in places we're not used to looking? How often do we write off entire groups of people because they don't look like what we think genius is supposed to look like? A woman in the third row, the one who had suggested calling the police earlier, looked down at her lap, her face flushed. "Samuel found me," Thomas said. "He saw something in a 9-year-old boy from a poor family, and he invested in me. Not for money, not for recognition. He did it because he believed it was the right thing to do. He did it because he loved music, and he loved teaching, and he believed that was enough reason." He turned to Elijah again. And then, even when his own life fell apart, even when he lost everything, he kept teaching. He taught his grandson. He passed on everything he knew, everything he valued, everything that mattered to him, right up until the end. Thomas's voice broke slightly. "I owe everything to Samuel Morrison. My career, my success, every beautiful moment I've had in music, it all started with him. And I failed him. I got successful, and I forgot where I came from. I forgot the man who made it all possible. I told myself I'd reach out someday, but someday never came. And by the time I thought to really try to find him, it was too late." He was crying again now, not trying to hide it. "I can't make that right. Samuel is gone. I can't thank him. I can't help him. I can't tell him what his faith in me meant, how it shaped my entire life." Thomas took a deep breath. "But I can do something. I can help the student he left behind. I can make sure that Samuel's last investment, his final act of teaching and belief and love, doesn't end with his grandson living on the street." He looked directly at Elijah. "If you'll let me, I want to help you. I want to make sure you have a place to live, food, to eat, stability. I want to arrange for you to continue your musical education. I want to take you on as my student personally, to continue the teaching that Samuel started." Elijah stared at him, his mouth open, unable to process what he was hearing. "I can't bring your grandfather back," Thomas said gently. "I can't undo the loss you've suffered or the hardships you've endured. But I can make sure that you have a chance to develop the gift he worked so hard to give you. I can make sure his faith in you, his investment in you, leads somewhere beautiful." He turned back to the audience. "And I'm asking all of you to help too. This is supposed to be a charity concert, right? We're supposed to be raising money for good causes. Well, I can't think of a better cause than making sure this young man has the opportunity to reach his full potential." Thomas walked to the edge of the stage. "Here's what I'm proposing. I'll personally fund Elijah's education and living expenses for the next year. That's my commitment, my way of honoring Samuel's memory. But beyond that, I'm asking you to contribute. Not to some abstract charity, but to something concrete, something you've seen and heard tonight. Let's create a fund right here, right now, to support Elijah's musical development, to make sure he has everything he needs, not just to survive, but to thrive." He pulled out his phone. "I'm going to give you a number. Text Elijah to this number, and you'll get a link to a fund I'm setting up right now. Or you can write checks, cash, whatever you want. We'll collect it all tonight. Every dollar goes directly to supporting this young man's education and future." Thomas was making this up as he went, but it felt right. It felt necessary. This wasn't about publicity or tax write-offs or feeling good about oneself. This was about actually doing something concrete to help someone who deserved help. "You've seen what he can do," Thomas said, gesturing to Elijah. "You've heard his potential. You've witnessed what Samuel's teaching created. Now let's make sure it doesn't end here. Let's make sure Elijah gets the chance to become everything he can be." The audience erupted. People were already pulling out their phones, pulling out checkbooks. The woman who had been crying earlier stood up. "I'll donate $10,000, she called out, her voice shaking. For Samuel, who believed in teaching everyone, and for Elijah, who proves he was right. 15,000, a man in the back shouted. 20,000, called another voice. Thomas held up his hands, overwhelmed. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you. This is what Samuel would have wanted. This is how we honor him. Not just by remembering him, but by continuing his work." He turned to Elijah, who was standing frozen, tears running down his face, his whole body shaking. "Is this okay?" Thomas asked quietly. "I know this is a lot. I know I'm making decisions that affect your life, but I want to help. I need to help. Will you let me?" Elijah tried to speak, but couldn't. He nodded instead, then suddenly lunged forward and hugged Thomas, burying his face in the taller man's jacket, his thin body racked with sobs. Thomas held him, this boy he'd only met an hour ago, but who was connected to him through music and teaching, and a shared love for a man who had changed both their lives. He held him while Elijah cried out 2 years of grief and fear and loneliness and loss. He held him while the audience watched, many of them crying themselves, moved by the raw emotion of the moment. "It's okay," Thomas murmured. "You're going to be okay, I promise. I'll make sure of it. Samuel would want me to make sure of it." After a long moment, Elijah pulled back, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "Thank you," he managed to say, his voice hoarse. "Thank you. I don't know what else to say. Just thank you." Thomas smiled. "You don't have to say anything. You've already said everything you need to say. You said it with your playing. You honored Samuel with every note you played tonight. He would be so proud of you. I know he would be." Elijah nodded, trying to compose himself. "He used to tell me that music could change lives. I never really understood what he meant. I thought he just meant it could make you feel good or help you express emotions or something like that. But now I think I get it. Music changed your life when you were young, and tonight it's changing mine." "That's exactly what Samuel meant," Thomas agreed. "Music isn't just entertainment. It's not just beauty for beauty's sake. It's a force that connects people, that reveals truth, that creates possibilities where none existed before." He looked out at the audience, then back at Elijah. "Tonight, in this room, because of music, because of what your grandfather taught, both of us, something impossible became possible. A homeless boy and a famous pianist found each other. A debt I thought could never be repaid has been at least partially addressed, and a whole room full of people who might have driven past you on the street without a second glance are now invested in your future." Thomas put his hand on Elijah's shoulder. "That's the power of what Samuel gave us. Not just the ability to play piano, but the understanding that music matters, that art matters, that people matter, regardless of their circumstances." The audience, which had been quietly listening to this exchange, broke into applause again. But this time, it wasn't just for the performance. It was for everything this moment represented, for the connection that had been made for the future that was opening up for a boy who had thought his future was over. The scene shifted. It was no longer the night of the concert, but 6 months later. Elijah stood in front of a mirror in a small but comfortable apartment, adjusting his tie. He was wearing a new suit, properly fitted, and his hair was neatly trimmed. He looked different, healthier, more confident. But his eyes were the same, still carrying that depth, that understanding that came from having experienced real hardship. On the dresser beside him was a photograph in a simple frame. It showed an older man, gray-haired, with kind eyes and weathered hands resting on the shoulders of a much younger Elijah, his grandfather, Samuel Morrison. Next to the photograph was a piece of cardboard carefully preserved with piano keys drawn on it in marker, his first keyboard, the one his grandfather had made. Elijah picked up the cardboard, running his fingers over the drawn keys. He did this every day before he practiced a ritual, a remembrance. "I'm trying to make you proud, Grandpa," he whispered. "I hope I'm doing okay." There was a knock on the door. "Elijah. Are you ready? We need to leave in 5 minutes." "Coming," Elijah called back. He carefully placed the cardboard back on the dresser next to the photograph, then grabbed his jacket. The apartment Thomas had arranged for him was in a safe neighborhood close to the music conservatory, where Elijah was now enrolled as a full-time student. He had his own room, his own space, his own piano, a nice upright that Thomas had bought for him. It wasn't a concert grand, but it was more than Elijah had ever dreamed of having. For the first 6 months, Thomas had checked on him almost daily, making sure he was adjusting, making sure he had everything he needed. They had lessons twice a week, private lessons, where Thomas passed on everything he knew, just as Samuel had done for him 20 years earlier. "You're carrying on a tradition," Thomas had told him during one of their early lessons. "Samuel taught me, I'm teaching you, and someday you'll teach others. That's how it works. That's how knowledge and beauty perpetuate themselves." The fund that the audience had created that night had grown beyond anyone's expectations. The local news had covered the story, and donations had poured in from all over the country. There was enough to support Elijah's education through high school and into college, with funds left over for other young musicians from difficult circumstances. Thomas had been true to his word in every way. But more than just providing financial support, he'd become something like a mentor, a guardian, a connection to the grandfather Elijah had lost. He'd introduced Elijah to other musicians, taken him to concerts, shown him the world of professional music that Samuel had once shown to Thomas. And Elijah had flourished. With stability, with proper nutrition, with consistent practice time and quality instruction, his already impressive talent had begun to truly develop. His teachers at the conservatory were amazed by him, by his work ethic, by the depth of his musical understanding, by the way he could take criticism and immediately apply it. But Elijah never forgot where he came from. He volunteered at homeless shelters playing piano for people who rarely heard live music. He visited the community center on the east side, the one where Samuel had taught, which had reopened with funding from the same charity concert that had changed Elijah's life. He played for kids there, talked to them about music, tried to be for them what his grandfather had been for him. Now, 6 months after that transformative night, Elijah was preparing for something significant. His first public recital as a conservatory student. Thomas would be there, of course. So would many of the people who had been at the charity concert. So would reporters curious to see how the homeless piano prodigy was doing. But Elijah wasn't nervous. Or rather, he was nervous in the normal way any musician gets nervous before a performance, not in the terrified way he'd been nervous that night at the community center. He knew what he was going to play. The program included the Chopin Nocturne, the first piece he'd played for a real audience, and it included the first movement of the Rachmaninoff Concerto, which he would play as a true solo this time, without accompaniment the way it was never meant to be played, but which would showcase his ability to bring out both the solo and orchestral elements on a single piano. And he was going to dedicate the performance to Samuel Morrison, whose name would be printed in the program, whose photograph would be displayed in the lobby, whose legacy was alive and growing through the music of his grandson. As Elijah left his apartment and got into the car where Thomas was waiting to drive him to the recital hall, he felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. He felt hope. Not just hope for himself, for his future, but hope for what music could do, for what teaching could do, for what human kindness could do when it was actually put into action. "Ready for tonight?" Thomas asked as they pulled into traffic. "Ready," Elijah confirmed. "Your grandfather would be incredibly proud," Thomas said. "You know that, right?" Elijah nodded. "I hope so. I try to play the way he taught me. I try to remember everything he said about music being a conversation, about it being something that belongs to everyone." "You do more than remember," Thomas said. "You live it, just like Samuel did." They drove in comfortable silence for a while. Then Elijah spoke again. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you think things happen for a reason? Like, do you think it was somehow meant to be that I ended up at that concert, that you were there, that everything connected the way it did?" Thomas considered the question. "I don't know if I believe in fate exactly," he said slowly. "But I do believe that sometimes when we're open to it, life gives us opportunities to make things right, to honor our debts, to connect with people we're supposed to connect with. That night I could have said no when you asked to play. The security guard wanted me to. It would have been easier to just have you removed and continue with my planned program. Why didn't you?" Elijah asked. "Because there was something in your eyes," Thomas admitted. "Something that reminded me of myself at your age. Desperate, hungry for music, willing to risk embarrassment and rejection just for a chance to play. And also, though I didn't realize it consciously at the time, there was something familiar about you, something I couldn't quite place. Now I know it was Samuel's influence, his way of teaching, coming through in how you carried yourself, how you looked at the piano." He glanced at Elijah. "So maybe it was fate. Or maybe it was just a series of choices, yours and mine, that happened to align. Either way, I'm grateful it happened." "Me too," Elijah said softly. "Every day, me too." The recital that night was a triumph. Elijah played brilliantly, with even more confidence and skill than he'd shown 6 months earlier. The audience, many of whom had been there for his first performance, gave him a standing ovation that lasted nearly 5 minutes. But the real significance of the evening wasn't just in Elijah's success. It was in what that success represented. It was proof that Samuel Morrison's belief in the power of music and teaching had been correct. It was validation of the idea that talent exists everywhere in all circumstances, and that what separates those who develop their talent from those who don't is often simply access and opportunity. After the recital, Thomas stood with Elijah as people came up to congratulate him, to take photos, to tell him how moved they'd been. Among them was a woman with a young girl, maybe 9 years old. "My daughter wants to learn piano," the woman said to Thomas and Elijah, "but we can't afford lessons. I was wondering, is there anywhere you could recommend? Somewhere that might work with us on cost?" Elijah's face lit up. "Actually," he said, "I've started teaching on Saturdays at the community center on the east side, where my grandfather used to teach. It's free, completely free. If you're interested, bring her by this weekend." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "Really? You'd do that?" "It's what my grandfather would have done," Elijah said simply. "It's what he did do for years. I'm just continuing his work." After the woman left with her daughter, Thomas looked at Elijah with an expression of profound respect. "You're teaching already." "Just started a month ago," Elijah confirmed. "I can't let that center close again, and I can't let Samuel's legacy end. So I'm doing what I can. Right now it's just a few kids on Saturday mornings, but maybe someday it'll be more." Thomas put his hand on Elijah's shoulder, the gesture that had become familiar between them. "You know what, I think I'll join you. I haven't taught in a long time, but maybe it's time I did. Maybe we can make it a real program, get other professional musicians involved. We could call it the Samuel Morrison Music Initiative." Elijah's eyes widened. "You'd do that, I should have done it years ago," Thomas said. "I should have honored Samuel this way a long time ago. Better late than never." As the evening wound down and people began to leave, Elijah and Thomas stood together in the empty recital hall. The piano sat silent on the stage, waiting for the next performance, the next musician, the next story. "Your grandfather was right about everything," Thomas said quietly. "Music does change lives. Teaching does matter. And beauty is too important to be kept away from people just because of their circumstances." Elijah nodded. "He used to say that music was a gift that grew when you gave it away. The more you shared it, the more you had. I didn't understand that when I was younger, but I do now." "So do I," Thomas agreed. "Finally, after all these years, I really understand what Samuel was trying to teach me. It wasn't just about piano technique or musical interpretation. It was about responsibility, about using whatever gifts we have to help others develop theirs." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Elijah spoke one more time. "Thank you," he said, "for everything. For that night 6 months ago. For all the help since then. For keeping me connected to my grandfather's legacy. For being who you are." Thomas smiled. "No," he said. "Thank you. You've given me something I didn't know I was missing. A chance to repay an old debt, a way to honor someone who deserved honoring, and a reminder of why I fell in love with music in the first place." He looked at the piano, then back at Elijah. Samuel's story didn't end when he died. It didn't even end when he lost his home and his health. It continues through you, through me, through every person we teach, through every life touched by the music he loved and the teaching he dedicated his life to. That's the real legacy. Not just the notes we play, but the lives we touch, the opportunities we create, the doors we open for others. Elijah smiled a full, genuine smile that lit up his entire face. "Grandpa would like that," he said. "He would really like that." And somewhere in whatever place Samuel Morrison now existed, he was smiling too. His work was continuing. His students were teaching others. His belief in the power of music to transform lives was being proven right over and over again. The concert hall emptied. The lights dimmed. But the music, the real music, the music that lives in human hearts and connections, and the passing of knowledge from one generation to the next, that music played on. It would always play on. Because that's what Samuel had taught them. That's what they would teach others. And that, in the end, was the most beautiful performance of all.